When it comes to literature, what famous authors come to mind? Charles Dickens, Leo Tolstoy, Stephanie Meyer? What man could have made so much of an impact that he should be remembered for all time? His name is Fyodor Dostoevsky, a Russian author from Moscow, Russia, and he is quite possibly a god among writers today. Dostoevsky started life with a relatively nice footing. The second of 6 children born to Mikhail and Maria Dostoevsky, his family life was less than to be desired. His mother was warm and loving and taught Dostoevsky at a young age using Bible references.
As a young Dostoevsky was growing, his mother taught him how to read using stories from the Old and New Testament. His teachings became infused with the Bible as religion and God became the focal points behind much of his work. His favorite story was that of Job, a man who strived through numerous afflictions without renouncing God. We can now interpret that Dostoevsky saw much of his father in the story through the many struggles he faced, such as his nervous disorder, which is never diagnosed, and his fits of drinking.
His father, on the other hand, was vastly more domineering and abusive. He would regularly beat his children and his serfs with little or no agitation. There are stories about how, as his father slept, Dostoevsky was forced to watch over him and swat flies that came near him. A surgeon by trade, the years of gruesome and often hopeless operations left this man bereft of any other emotion than despair. During his childhood around Moscow, Dostoevsky was constantly confronted with images of despair. His physical environment did little to lift this sense of gloom. The hospital sat in a neighborhood of squalor, one of the worst areas in Moscow. The landmarks included a cemetery for criminals, a lunatic asylum, and an orphanage for abandoned infants. His wandering through the hospital garden, talking to patients and listening to their sad stories, instilled a sense of compassion toward the ill-refuted and the oppressed. Over the years, Dostoevsky's father attained a rank that allowed him to own serfs and land. The peasants suffering under his rule inspired an almost religious feeling in Dostoevsky. He came to idealize the peasants as capable of spiritual understanding, purer than any that might be achieved by the overly intellectual members of his own class. Poetic justice would take its toll, as Mikhail would be ambushed and killed by his own serfs in 1838, with his wife dying of tuberculosis just the year before. At the age of 16, Dostoevsky became an orphan, and his family life ended. Finishing his education, however, became his major priority.
At his school, Dostoevsky really was a man trapped by his surroundings. He disliked his schoolwork, he despised his school friends, and he really was just bored with everything. In fact, the only thing to come out of this time was just a few close friends, to which he could really talk literature to. I mean, no one really shared his interest with eternal questions of what does it mean to be, and really just what is life and all those. Plus, his grades were pretty mediocre. There's probably a lesson in that.
His frustration would come to an end over the years as he became more renowned in his writing abilities through such novels as Notes from the Underground and Poor Folk. He would be arrested due to his involvement in the liberal intellectual group, the Petroshevsky Circle. After a mock execution, Dostoevsky was sentenced to 4 years in exile in Siberia, where he lived in a dilapidated barracks, which should have been demolished years ago. After his release, he was required to serve in the Siberian Regiment, where he served 5 years as private and later a lieutenant in the regiment's 7th Line Battalion. It was also during this time that he met his future wife Maria, which he married in 1857.
Dostoevsky,
He continued to grow in his literary prowess and became much more critical of the currently growing interest in contemporary European philosophy. During 1864, 3 critical events happened in Dostoevsky's life. His second magazine venture would fail, his wife would die due to consumption, and his brother would lose the battle against liver failure. These events left him embittered in the way prison had not. It was also during this time that he came up with a master plan for a novel. This novel was to be about a murder, its causes and its consequences. For the book, Dostoevsky envisioned a proud and an intelligent protagonist, impoverished by circumstance, who commits a perfect crime, and then suffers from an attack of a conscience he did not even know he had. Furthermore, the book would reflect Dostoevsky's long-standing interest in the nature of crime and criminals, as well as the social problems caused by the financial crisis and extreme poverty of Russia of the 1860s. This book was, of course, Crime and Punishment. To fully comprehend the story of Crime and Punishment itself, one would first have to understand the social and cultural movements of this era.
Much of the cultural stagnation in Russia can be attributed to their overall isolation from much of Western Europe over the centuries. The Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Renaissance barely fazed Russia as they transformed the West into modern nations. Russia just didn't change that much.
Large-scale invasions would also disrupt development and production throughout much of Russia over the centuries. This has led to their historical suspicion of other countries. The government of Russia had the tradition of being extremely centralized, where the absolute power was held by either the Tsar or the Tsarina. Their tight grip on policy didn't allow for much intellectual reform. There was also a period of attempted westernization, where numerous modern technologies and ideas were introduced, though they were often suppressed. The 1830s to the 1860s had Russia stirred by many new factions. There were the Westernizers, who were influenced by German philosophy and by social ideas that developed in Western Europe during the Industrial Revolution. They were also influenced by contemporary European revolutionary movements. They were not very cohesive in their methods and goals. Another faction was the Slavophiles, who felt that Western ideals of rationalism and modernization were dangerous and alien to Russia.
It was really during this time that the Tsar and the Tsarina really came into control. Much of the absolute control of the country led to the inevitable intellectual debates. Should they introduce the rationalism that aided the rest of Europe, or simply revert to Russia's native values of spirituality? Despite these disagreements, they all agreed that the existing government should go.
It was during this period that Dostoevsky was arrested and really changed in his political ideas.
Prison life and his socialist ideas had really changed Dostoevsky. He renounced political idealism and came to embrace the Slavic idealism that was spreading throughout this time. This shift can be seen in Crime and Punishment, where the nihilist radicals, personified by Raskolnikov, were viewed as outright wrong-headed.
By the time Dostoevsky wrote Crime and Punishment, Tsar Alexander II attempted a significant reform, which freed millions of serfs, and numerous other policies in the military and police force. Alas, these reforms failed to fix the old problems and created new ones. The ideas of widespread poverty, ignorance, and social agitation continued to persist, and forms the background for much of the novel.